great day not to have a voice. This is really... I think what we presented earlier today speaks for itself. I'm sure you're all very much aware of it. So I thought I'd immediately give over to you for your questions, and then I could perhaps elaborate on some of the issues you might want to discuss with me.
Please.
Hello, Vice President Paula Tama for Politico Europe. My question would relate to the discussions that is going to happen tomorrow in the Council. So could I please ask you to elaborate on the decision to present a climate law enshrining the objective of achieving climate neutrality by mid-century, regardless of the fact that 3 countries have not yet consented or endorsed this goal? So how do you hope to win their consensus over tomorrow? Thank you.
Well, we will present the climate law and its contents next year, after having done a decent impact assessments of the elements that we want to put in there, including the goals we want to attain intermediary in 2030. Tomorrow is about an agreement on climate neutrality by 2050 by all member states. I am hopeful that the Council might come to that agreement, but we'll have to wait and see. For us as Commission, it is very clear that if we want to fulfil our commitments under the Paris Agreement and to limit the rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees, we will have to increase our efforts, and we will have to have a climate neutral Europe by 2050. And if you accept that premise, then you have to start counting back. You have to start planning for how you're going to get there. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in an open way, offering the possibility for all stakeholders to be part of that discussion, creating a climate pact with all stakeholders so that they can bring forward their ideas, their plans, their suggestions, and then we can come up with the best possible policy mix to get us there by 2050 and to get us also at a decent level by 2030, which is tomorrow because it's just in 10 years' time.
Sorry, in the back.
Olaf Christensen, Danish TV. You've set a goal for 2030, which would be either a reduction of 50% or maybe 55%. Yes. But science has recommended that it should be for the European Union as a whole 65%. Yes. Why haven't you settled on the more ambitious target if indeed the European Union does want to stick to the recommendations of science?
Because we have decided to have a careful impact assessment of what it means to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030. It has consequences for the way our economy is organized, for the way our energy sector is organized, for the way our mobility is organized. And I do not want to set a target that sounds nice, but is completely detached from reality of what we could possibly achieve. I think if we come to the conclusion that we have to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030, this would have huge implications for the policy choices we will have to make in the years to come. And I think this is just sound governance to make sure that before you do something, you do a decent impact assessment so that we will be ready to know exactly what we need to do by, let's say, June next year.
Yes, Giovanni Del Re from the Italian newspaper Avvenire, Mr. Vice President. Speaking about investments which are needed and so on, can you imagine that also the Stability Stability Pact can be changed? I mean, can be relaxed to, for example, exempt from the deficit calculations the investment for, I mean, the necessary investment for in this area?
It would be so refreshing if once a Dutch journalist would ask whether we could relax the rules of the Stability Pact. But joking aside, I think there is a lot of discussion going on with member states saying we will need massive investments to green our economy. These investments yield huge results, and should these investments always be calculated in the Growth and Stability Pact? The discussion has been put on the table. So I would be open to that discussion. But I'm not naive. I'm not naive. I know that if you open that discussion, very often it's used as a pretext not to observe the Growth and Stability Pact at all, and that would not be wise. But it is for a reason that we also announced that we will have a close look at state aid rules, that we will have a close look at other rules that were devised in a different situation, and that we would need to adapt for both the climate change challenge and the transformation as a consequence of the fourth industrial revolution.
Yes, good morning. Maria Maggiore, Investigate Europe. Mr. Timmermans, what is in this ambitious plan the place that natural gas will have? I mean, we know there is a discussion outside and there are studies now proving how dangerous are methane emissions for the atmosphere, but still it seems it should be in the next energetic mix for the future. So can you explain us what place natural gas will have?
Well, natural gas is a fossil fuel like all other fossil fuels and will have to be phased out at some point. But I also know that natural gas is the fossil fuel which phasing out will take probably longer than other fossil fuels and will play a role in the transition as well. This is also, I believe, a reality. But the goal should be for Europe to rid itself of fossil fuels. And I believe that the infrastructure, for instance, we have for LNG and natural gas in the future could be very useful, for instance, for a hydrogen-based economy and hydrogen-based energy carriers. So, again, I do not see a sustainable future in any form of fossil fuels, but I also understand that natural gas in the transition to a carbon-free energy mix will play its role.
Please.
Bonjour, Monsieur Timmermans. C'est Masmoup.
Mr. Timmermans, I represent the African press.
Africaine, oui.
Yes, indeed, the African press. Part, at least, of the African press. Various media of the African press. Le Point and Le Combat, to be precise. Now, this Green Deal has been presented as an ambitious Europe. Now, of course, Europe being ambitious, it could be of interest or concern to Africa. And of course, we've kept close tabs on what you do since you've taken your post. But this Green Deal, then, could it be also on the agenda of this new cooperation which is being developed between the EU and Africa? Africa is not just about migratory flows. There are climate change events which have a real impact on people. We have an impact along our coastline as well. And for some time now in Africa, there's an environmental dimension which is being developed. Now, you mentioned an impact assessment. Does your impact assessment then take into account the interests of your African partners too? And do you have the ambition to reach out to them as part of this new partnership? Now, President von der Leyen has been to Africa and spoke to the President of the African Union, and she came back with the conclusion that for the next meeting between the European Commission and the Committee of the African Union, there will be a discussion on the New Deal. So that's already been agreed, and there's a great deal of interest on the African side to be part of those discussions and to develop projects together. On a personal note, I believe that when it comes to energy, there is a real opportunity to be seized. There's a real opportunity for a cooperation between the EU and Africa. In certain African countries, we see that citizens who don't have access to any type of energy source have direct access now to electricity generated by photovoltaic. So a huge leap forward. And I think that, in essence, is a real opportunity for Africa. You don't have to go through all of these stages of development under the third industrial revolution, and you can enter the fourth industrial revolution straight away. Of course, demography in African countries is something to take into account too. You have young generations who are increasingly well educated, and they will be able to create enormous economic opportunities, and will also be able to establish a link between the two candidates. If Europe and Africa don't take each other into account, who will? The others certainly won't, so it's up to us.
Estonian Public Broadcasting, Eppehand. Could you explain a bit what's your idea how it will work? How many regions do you imagine could be suitable for this program? And the jobs will be created by companies and entrepreneurs. Yes. How would you make it attractive to them?
Well, let's be very clear. For this transition, we estimate that we would need a level of annual investment of about 260 billion euros every year if Europe is to make this transition. So the just transition mechanism is not the mechanism that's going to make that happen. The just transition mechanism is the mechanism you use when the transition in some areas of Europe, for some reason, is not just. Because the area lags behind, because it has special challenges, because, for instance, the energy mix is still way back in the coal economy. And these areas will have more trouble transforming themselves in this new economy, in this carbon-free economy, than other areas. And then I think these areas should be able to appeal to pan-European solidarity to make that happen. That's when the just transition mechanism comes in. This could, for instance, the restructuring of regions where coal mining is monoculture, for instance, but also in industries that have no future because they don't reflect the new economy and they need to be restructured. But also because, let's be very clear, it is easy to say this new economy is going to create a lot of jobs, because it will. But the jobs will not be the same jobs as the previous jobs, and they might not be in the same place either. So if you're a worker, if you're a coal miner in a certain region today, and you're being told, yes, your coal mine is closing, but we have so many more extra jobs, and that those extra jobs are somewhere completely different, and they require skills you don't have, it doesn't help you or your region, does it? So the Just Transition Fund should help to create economic opportunity in regions where this is more difficult, and should also be used to create opportunities for people to be reskilled or to get new skills so that they can take the jobs that there are, because the market will not pay for that. So that's how I see the functioning of the Just Transition mechanism.
Please.
Winkers, Telegraaf, Netherlands. I have a question concerning a smarter way of transportation. Is there going to be a charge on driving? And what exactly are you thinking about? Can you give a little bit more details? And another question is about nuclear energy. Where do you see that in the transition period? Is there a place for that?
First of all, on transportation, we want to make sure that Europeans can have the mobility they need and they want. That's the starting position. But this mobility will have to change in some ways. I think we need to put a price on the cost of that mobility if it is based on fossil fuels. So that would mean putting a price on driving cars with combustion engines. And there are different ways of going about this. You could do this on a European level. You could have national schemes. But what we're doing is not putting a prescription on the table. We're opening the debate with the member states to say, if we really want to make this transition to clean transport, you will have to look at putting a price on using combustion engines. So you would price combustion engine, but you would not price electric mobility or fuel cell-based mobility, for instance. Also, we will have to make it more interesting and more accessible to use other forms of transport. It would be great to reinstate a network of night trains in Europe, so you can travel from major European cities by night in a train instead of taking the plane. And I still find it very strange that when you fill up your car with petrol, you pay tax on that petrol, and quite a lot of tax on that petrol, by the way. If you take the train company has to pay tax on the electricity used to drive the train. But if you take a plane, the kerosene used by the plane is not taxed. That doesn't make sense, in my view. And I think many citizens understand that that doesn't make sense. Also here, you will have to act at a European level because you need to create a level playing field. You can't do this individually. And that's also, I think, the weakness in national plans for a ticket tax. Because if you only do national schemes, then you would have sort of a waterbed effect that people will go elsewhere if that would be too much of a burden. So our position is that we should look for European solutions for what is a global problem. And then if we look for European solutions, for instance, on kerosene tax, you could also, in the framework of IATA, make sure that this is compatible with your global responsibilities. Nuclear energy. I have no ideological inhibitions. I have no ideological or other problems with nuclear energy. It is quite clear that, well, nuclear energy is not a sustainable form of energy, but nuclear energy is also a form of energy with no CO2 emissions. So it will be part of the energy mix that will lead us to a carbon neutral society. And as you know, the European Commission is still part of an effort to make nuclear energy scientifically even better. So there is no rejection by the European Commission of nuclear energy per se or in principle, but it's also not a sustainable form of energy in the long run.
Bonjour. Par ici.
Hello, I'm over here. Fanny Roux for Context. Could I just come back to energy taxation and transport? Now, there's going to be a revision of the Energy Taxation Directive, and you want to use a qualified majority for this rather than unanimity. Could you tell us when you're planning on getting started with that? Because it will, because the previous revision will be done away with then, and then in your communication, you say that you want to develop rail and inland waterways transport. Now, what are you going to do this time round to achieve that? Because it's been part of a programme previously. On your first question, the Commission is going to use the passerelle clause. Because we really need to radically overhaul the directive. We can't leave things as they are. External conditions have changed, and the legislation needs to follow suit. Of course, it will depend on the Member State willingness to accept the passerelle clause, because you need unanimity to accept it. But I think there's a sense of urgency now amongst Member States, and there's been a shift there too. So we will certainly be putting forward a proposal which will be of interest to the Member States. But we can't just leave it to one side. We really need to tackle it head on. Then on rail, if we look at the obstacles to transport using rail, then it's the time it takes. We have a Europe without borders, but if you look at rail, then there's borders everywhere. And trains wait at border crossings a very long time because there are different safety regulations in place in Member States. There's an issue with electrification between Member States. The drivers might have to change, and so on. And that's where progress needs to be made. And you quite rightly asked me what has changed now. Well, it's this sense of urgency which our citizens are aware of and feel, and which is felt elsewhere. If we want our citizens to be able to travel without having an all too greater impact on the environment, then we need to make the use of trains possible. And in particular, lorries, we use lorries far too much and too often, and that needs to be shifted to rail. Take the Swiss example. They've increased the percentage of freight transport by rail, and of course we can look at the measures that they've taken. It's an important challenge for the European economy. If you ask companies why they use rail for freight, then they say, well, because we're not sure when our product will be delivered, because they have this just-in-time model, and that doesn't work if we can't be sure when the train arrives. So I think we can become active there, and it's urgent. We can't continue along the lines we've currently been exploring.
Jack Schickler, MLEX. Member states today in Coreper rejected the proposed deal on the green taxonomy, which is one of the centerpieces of the EU's green financing strategy that's needed to underpin quite a lot of the other ideas you put forward today on eco-labels, on green bonds and so on. Do you think that's a worrying signal about the appetite of member states to agree to these various measures you've put forward today? And do you have a message for those member states who are still refusing to agree to the deal?
I'm under no illusion that this will be easygoing on all these subjects. It's going to be a tough fight, but it's also worthwhile. And if we can demonstrate to member states why it's in their interest to move along these lines, perhaps we can convince them. I think it's high time we moved on taxonomy. I haven't analysed the Coreper discussions yet. I hope to be doing that later today or tomorrow. And then we will have to see as Commission how we can perhaps find a solution. But greening our tax system has to be a priority. And there is increasing understanding for this in Member States, but apparently still not enough.
Question in Dutch, if I may. I think there is translation. Rob Herbert, VRT.
I'm Rob Herbert, VRT News. Member states currently are developing their national climate and energy plans. Will they have to revise those plans in light of the new 2030 targets? And I don't know whether you're aware of the Flemish climate ambitions for 2030. We want to have a reduction of 32.5%. Is that ambitious enough as you see it, or should it be higher? It's very difficult for me to know about the specific Flemish plans and assess those. I met Minister De Mier in Madrid yesterday, and she was very proud of the targets that had been set. And I said, well, we're going to suggest a 50 to 55% reduction. And she just looked at me and went, ah. I'm not sure what to make of it, but all member states have signed up to the Paris targets and have said that they will develop national plans which will allow them to implement the Paris targets. That is true for Belgium as it is for Flanders. And that's the benchmark against which we need to assess plans. And that's what I tried to explain yesterday as well.
Oui, bonjour.
Yes, hello. Pascal Zenz from Agence Europe. Just a point of clarification. The just transition mechanism applies to all regions then, but the Just Transition Fund is geared towards carbon-dependent regions. That's correct. Not only coal. Sorry, I was getting ahead of myself. The mechanism can apply to all regions in the EU. The fund is specifically for regions where specific transition needs arise. Those could be regions dependent on coal or with an industry in difficulty. These could be regions with specific social problems, employment. So not only coal, but it's for regions in a position of difficulty.
Pardon. Dans ce cadre, est-ce que pour la Commission...
Well, against that backdrop, is the Just Transition Fund for the Commission, then, a way of dealing with the negotiation box? Because you can give more financial aid to regions while keeping to the cohesion fund. And, of course, the coal-dependent regions are to be found predominantly in Central and Eastern Europe.
Plus généralement, non seulement sur le charbon.
Not just in relation to coal, but more generally, in order to have an agreement on the multi-annual financial framework, on the budget, we will have to reconcile those countries who say not a euro more with those countries who say not a euro less. And there's a compromise to be found. And in order to arrive at that compromise, to redirect certain EU resources towards the Green Deal will allow us to convince those who have difficulty in accepting a higher budget. And those countries might say, well, we end up paying a bit more, but the money is being redirected towards new policies. And what I fear is that the compromise might end up being to leave things as they are and to find compromises by making cuts to other funds, climate, new economic models, and so on. And that would be a very disappointing result. And it would stop us from investing in the new economy and investing in measures which will allow us to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And some kind of dynamic needs to be found between those two groups of countries. We say to some, well, you're paying a bit more than you'd hoped for, but the money is going towards the future rather than the past.
Very much. With this one, I'm afraid we'll take the last one.
Yes. Two things. One, for the trains, it's also the price, but that's a natural monopoly, so good luck. The other thing, in your communication, you have said that the carbon border measure, which raised a lot of interest, which is seen a bit as the other face of the measure, tightening targets here and protecting ourselves, will be only as an alternative to the existing protections for carbon leakage. So could you elaborate on how do you plan to phase this in? Would it be from day one, no more free allowances, no more compensation for energy, and we introduce the carbon border measure for these sectors, and which sectors, or phased in some other way? Thanks.
Yeah, I fully understand your question, but this is exactly the stuff we still need to elaborate in great detail. The principle is this. We assume that all those who have signed the Paris Agreement will take the necessary measures to get there. We will take the necessary measures. If others don't, we are under an obligation to protect our industry to prevent carbon leakage. And then the instruments we can use could be a border tax, could also be changing ETS, amending ETS, but that will depend on what countries we're talking about and what sectors we're talking about. But I, for one, would like to know if we, for instance, we invest in the steel industry and we are able to produce steel without any fossil fuel, by hydrogen, for instance. And then steel comes out from outside the EU that is produced with fossil fuel. Then I would like to have an analysis of the carbon footprint of these 2 tons of steel and be able to compare them and be able to compensate for the carbon footprint at the border if that is necessary. And so this is a very specific example of steel. This could be applied in other sectors, but it will be, we will have to find measures that are sector-specific, that address the situation in specific sectors. It could be a tax at the border, it could be in the ETS system, but this remains to be seen when we know exactly which sectors this will affect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thanks.